Good morning. Thank you for coming. I'm Stu Eisenstadt, former U.S. Ambassador to the European Union and co-chair with Jose Manuel Barroso of the Euro Growth Initiative of the Atlantic Council. The initiative is being led ably by Andre Montanino. It's a particular pleasure to welcome European Commission Vice President Dombrovskis back to this council. Before we start, those of you who will be following on Twitter, please use the hashtags EU Growth and Future Europe. Europe has reached a historic juncture where the decisions taken now will shape transatlantic relations and the global economy for decades to come. Today's headlines in Europe are dominated by the refugee crisis, a still unresolved debt problem, a possible Brexit, and overall a slow economic recovery from the fiscal crisis. This in turn threatens to undermine capital flows that are essential for innovation and market confidence in Europe. The geopolitical tensions stemming from the conflicts in the Ukraine and in the Middle East are contributing to the fragility of Europe's economy, especially the political and economic impact of the refugee crisis, which is putting a great stress on the cohesion of the Union. We oftentimes forget in the U.S. behind our two oceans that Europe is really at the cutting edge of both the Russia-Ukraine problem and the Middle East, which is only a couple of hundred miles away from Italy and from Greece. Yet there's a window of opportunity to ensure a stronger Europe in the future. European growth is of utmost importance, obviously for the people of Europe, but also for the United States, because the countries of the EU and the EU are our most important geopolitical allies. When we have challenges from Russia to Iran, we do not turn to Asia. We look to Europe, which shares common values and common interests. In addition, Europe's recovery and strong growth are essential to our own. Europe is by far the most important destination of American investments. To give you one small example, American companies invest more than 3 times the amount of direct investment in tiny Ireland than in China. By working together toward long-term growth and prosperity, Europe and the U.S. will remain global leaders and strengthen the critical partnership to face future challenges together, whether they're challenges of internal security, external security and international defense, or global economic governance. I want to emphasize that our Euro Growth Initiative is a partnership of equals. It is not an effort to look at finger pointing about who's done something wrong and who's done something right. The fact is that Euro growth over the last 25 years has been subpar relative to the U.S. But at the same time, we have a great deal to learn from the EU. Our income inequality is much greater. Our job training programs are virtually non-existent compared to those of many European countries. Through this Euro Growth Initiative, we can learn from each other and adapt our best practices for long-term growth, effective micro and macroeconomic policy to boost capital flows and provide new and innovative ideas. Today, we are continuing our path in this transatlantic effort, and there could be no better person to host for this event than the European Commission Vice President for Euro and Social Dialogue. In his role, he leads the effort to build a deeper and fairer European Monetary Union and EU by developing proposals for further structural reforms in the Eurozone enhancing the convergence of economic, fiscal, and labor market policies between EU countries, and steering the work of the Structural Reform Support Service. With the potential Brexit, there is palpable opposition to a further deepening of the EU, reinforced by the recent Dutch referendum. The Vice President is a strong advocate of an open and transparent exchange between members of the EMU and the rest of the EU to ensure that non-Eurozone countries can join EMU initiatives when they are interested in doing so, to build a deeper economic, fiscal, financial, and political union. This at the same time raises fundamental questions of whether the EU is moving toward a two concentric circle model, where some countries will deepen integration and others will remain more peripheral. My colleagues, Ambassador Boyden Gray and Ambassador Dick Morningstar, both of whom were also ambassadors to the EU and who are here, know that this was an issue even during their tenures and mine. But now it takes on even greater importance. It will be important to see how the institutional setting of the EU will look in 5 years as a result of the major challenges it faces. I'm delighted to have the Vice President here with us today to hear more of the way forward and how the transatlantic community can be engaged in a common strategy for the future. After his remarks, we'll have a Q&A session moderated by my dear friend Anders Ashland, a fellow at the Atlantic Council and also a member of the Eurogrowth Task Force. Before we hear from the Vice President, we have a really special treat. I'm very pleased that Andrius Kubilius, the former Prime Minister of Lithuania, has agreed to make a few comments. Andrius is a member of our Eurogrowth Initiative Task Force, and I know he'll make a critical contribution to the Atlantic Council's efforts to galvanize EU and U.S. stakeholders. It's also a great opportunity to hear now from two former heads of state, the Vice President and former President Kubilius. I do want to say, on a personal note, that I have a special relationship with Lithuania. My mother's family comes from Ukmergė. I've visited there. We've gotten the 1897 census, which is in remarkably good shape, that had the location of my great-grandparents and my grandfather and his siblings, and even down to the street in Ukmergė, which I saw when I was ambassador to the EU and doing my Holocaust work. More recently, in 2011, with my hat on as special advisor to then Secretary of State Clinton on Holocaust issues, and working with Ambassador Ann Dursey, our U.S. ambassador, and with the government of Lithuania, we reached a landmark $50 million agreement for Holocaust survivors in the Jewish community of Lithuania, which was again of special meaning to me. So with no further ado, Prime Minister Kubilius, if you would share with us a few words, and then we look forward very much to hearing from the Vice President.
Good morning to everybody, and it's really a big honor and privilege for me to be present in this event of Atlantic Council. And first of all, of course, I would like to thank Ambassador Eisenstadt for kind introduction. And of course, we in Lithuania are very proud that we have very many prominent representatives of our Litvak community, which before Holocaust was very strong. Unfortunately, the tragedies of 20th century destroyed all that community. But we share all the memories, and really, again, it's very, very nice to see Ambassador Eisenstadt. I would like also to thank Andrea Montanino and the Atlantic Council for inviting me to this very important event. Of course, we understand very well, European Union is at a crossroads in quite a deep crisis of different origin, but when we're looking into European history, so it looks like that this is very common for Europe, to go from one crisis to another crisis, and I am quite optimistic because of that. Because if you look from Rome Treaty till now, you can see that really Europe was developing itself, going from one crisis to another crisis and becoming more united, more consolidated, just because of the crisis. So crisis, as we know with Valdis Dombrovskis, is a good inspiration to do a proper job. So because of that, I'm really very glad to be part of the Atlantic Council Euro Growth Initiative, which, as you know, was launched with European Commission Vice President Jyrki Katainen, again, our colleague from Prime Minister's time, just last month. I am quite sure that this initiative provides a great platform, both for EU and US policymakers, business leaders, experts, to discuss and develop innovative transatlantic approaches that can guide the EU back towards a sustainable growth path, how to move out from this crisis. If you remember just the recent period of time, we with Valdis Dombrovskis and Andrus Ansip from Estonia, we were managing our countries during a really very painful period of crisis, starting from 2009, when in Lithuania economy went down by minus 15%, in Latvia perhaps even minus 18%, if I am correct. But economists, we managed to do our job, and economists recovered, and we can see really good perspective. And that is why, from our experience, what to do during the crisis and how to use the period of crisis for structural reforms in order to come back to the growth, we can share some thoughts about what is needed to be done in Europe. I have such a experience being 2 times Prime Minister, the first time back in 1999-2000, then in 2009-2012, that I have a nickname in Lithuania, Prime Minister of Crisis. So I'm waiting next crisis to become again Prime Minister, and it looks like that it can come. But really the question is, for me, is very simple. If you look really into the history and to ask yourself a very simple question, why some countries are showing good growth and others are lagging behind, I have a very simple answer. It's not that there is not known the recipe, what is needed to be done in order to really to have a good economy. The problem is not with the recipe. The problems are usually with political institutions and the leadership. So now in Europe we can hear somebody saying that in order to come back in Europe for growth, we need less of Europe. I'm in an opposite camp. I am always saying that in order to see in Europe much more of growth, we need exactly opposite. We need more of Europe, inside of Europe. So in order really to have stronger institutions and stronger leadership. More Europe means really stronger institutions and stronger leadership. And so that is why really I am very happy to be part of Euro Growth Initiative, and also I'm very happy this morning to have a discussion with Prime Minister, Vice President Valdis Dombrovskis, because I think he is exactly from that new generation of leadership in Europe, which is very much needed, and which has really good experience what to do when the crisis is hitting economy and how to come out with new initiatives, new ideas, which are really very much needed and which needs a proper and strong leadership. So, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Andres. Honorable colleagues, first of all, I would like to thank Atlantic Council for this invitation and for possibility to share some considerations as regards Europe's challenges Europe is facing and the way forward. The Belgian Nobel Prize winning physical chemist Ilya Prigozhin has described how systems can adapt and find a new equilibrium, how they can create order out of chaos, and how their fundamental openness is a characteristic that allows them to change. As he summed up, we grow in direct proportion to the amount of chaos we can withstand and dissipate. So don't worry, I'm not here to talk thermodynamics with you, but as a metaphor of both logic and limits of the European project in challenging times, the idea is an attractive one. Growth through openness, order out of chaos. These have in past have been key elements of Europe's success, and today the same principles are at stake. European integration has always been about adapting our governance structures to changing circumstances, both internally and externally, about using institutions to manage globalization. In this, our openness as a society and as an economy is a strength, even if in a democracy it's not always easy to manage. And once again, it is a task which we have ahead of us. With the financial, economic and sovereign debt crisis, we saw how interrelated our economies are and how the structures that previously brought us opportunities were insufficiently resilient to do the job when they were challenged. Since then, we have done a lot to strengthen the economic and monetary union architecture, but more needs to be done both at EU and at national level. With the refugee crisis, we now find that open borders at the heart of Europe's integration are in themselves inadequate. In times of tremendous pressure from outside, a common market demands cooperation on managing external borders as well, and a shared idea of common goods such as defense and security. And due to instability and geopolitical pressures in Europe's immediate environment, from Ukraine to Middle East and Africa, we find that the world's problems come knocking to our door, whether we feel like opening or not. And on top of all this, all of these shocks are of potentially divisive nature. They affect diverse parts of Europe differently. So they threaten to reopen gaps between richer and poorer countries, create disagreement between transit and destination countries, or increase pressure between principles of responsibility versus solidarity. And they are often perceived differently by countries with diverse democratic traditions, making the political recalibration all the more difficult. But this realization only reinforces our sense of responsibility, and my message is clear. Never underestimate Europe's will and ability to come to the solutions. When faced with common problems, we eventually find common systemic responses. That is too a lesson that Europe's history teaches us. Never has Europe's capability to create order out of chaos had been tested as severely as it's in the wake of the financial crisis. It has been the main task for EU leaders over the past few years, and the change it has brought about is profound. In economic terms, Prigozhin's ability to withstand pressure meant enhancing our crisis management capacity and undertaking reforms to address the root causes of crisis, such as tackling excessive debts, removing vulnerabilities in the financial sector, and improving our competitiveness. It has also spurred us to further deepen Europe's economic and monetary union to make our institutional foundations even more solid. And our capacity to dissipate shocks find a parallel in Europe's efforts to complete our single market and the integration of our economic and monetary unions. Part of this is to shape a real financial union so that opportunities are better spread and shocks are smoothed across the whole of our economy, while risks are effectively monitored and tackled with a functioning banking union. We have come a long way to improve the effectiveness of this system. in the response to the crisis, we have introduced an upgraded macroeconomic governance framework to better coordinate economic policy among member states, a macroeconomic imbalances procedure to detect and address economic imbalances early on, more sophisticated fiscal rules, a financial backstop, the European Stability Mechanism to provide temporary fiscal support to member states in difficulty. We have set up a banking union to weaken the bank sovereign loop and to ensure financial stability. And the European Central Bank has made full use of its monetary policy tools. So today the results are there. Europe's economy is now entering its fourth year of moderate but continued recovery. Last year, economic output either increased or was stable in every member state. It was the only exception where output was not increasing was Greece. But next year, provided that Greece program is also on track, all member states are expected to expand. Unemployment is on slow but steady decline. Last year it fell below 10% for the first time since 2011. This year it's expected to reach 9%. Lending to real economy has picked up into the euro area and real wages have started to increase. Government bond spreads anxiously watched during the crisis are now converging and decreasing. Wages and productivity have aligned further, with nominal unit labor costs converging since the crisis. EU exports have also picked up. Indeed, we have even surpassed levels recorded before the crisis. Total EU exports reached 6 trillion euros in 2015, as compared to 4.1 trillion in 2004, 20% increase even compared with the boom years or maybe even bubble years of 2007. Importantly, strong gains are also recorded in countries worst hit by the crisis and hence being some of the most active reformers since then. As for the overall credibility of the monetary union, it's important to note that market reactions to the last Greek crisis were notably subdued. It has been seen as a Greek crisis, serious enough in itself, and the work on correcting the problems certainly continues, but there were very little spillover effects to other euro area countries. This underlines the fact that reforms of the euro area governance structure, including the banking union and the European Stability Mechanism, have really paid off. But we still have work to do. We cannot yet be satisfied of the performance of the euro area. European integration is a tool for convergence in and among member states, and it needs to be fully restored. Last year, the report of presidents of the 5 most important EU institutions laid out a roadmap for more resilient, prosperous and fairer economic and monetary union, and we are working on its implementation. The European Commission's annual growth survey, which sets out economic policy priorities, focuses on 3 immediate concerns: relaunching investment, structural reforms to modernize our economies, and responsible fiscal policies. While the systemic work continues, further reinforcing the institutional foundations on which our economy rests, a boost in investment must help to revive our growth prospects. Our bond with the US is a great source of energy in this, and one we want to explore even further. There is plenty of liquidity available in Europe, as well as strong international interest to invest in Europe. Yet investment does not take off as it should. Current investment levels in the EU are well below what is considered a sustainable trend level of 20 to 21% of GDP. So why it is so? Uncertainty plays a major role. The lack of risk financing and the lack of certainty regarding projects and regulatory barriers and fragmentation continue to hamper investment. For that reason, the European Commission has launched European Fund for Strategic Investments, using public funding to attract private capital, create clarity and increase the broader momentum for investment in Europe. Since European Fund for Strategic Investment has entered into force in July 2015, the European Investment Bank has approved 54 projects for financing under EFSI framework to the tune of 7.2 billion euros, the main beneficiary being SMEs and mid-cap companies. The European Investment Fund has approved more than 150 SME financing agreements with a total financing of 3.4 billion. Together, these operations are expected to have triggered total investments of 82 billion euros already. So it means that the aim of EFSI to, with limited amount of public financing, to unlock substantially larger amounts of private investment is really working. The same rationale underpins Commission's work on fostering the Capital Markets Union, one of the areas where differences between member states remain large and where there are plenty of opportunities left to integrate them. To compare, EU's economy is larger than the US, but our equity markets are less than half as large and our debt markets are less than 1/3. Here in the US, small and medium-sized companies raise about 5 times as much funding from capital markets as in the EU. And venture capital markets as deep as the US could have provided us with an additional 90 billion euros in the past 5 years. So we are working hard on knocking down barriers and synchronizing rules so that European capital markets fully live to their potential. A truly European Capital Markets Union would be able to better transmit monetary policy effects to the real economy, promote private risk sharing and resilience. This is also a natural complement to the banking union, which we set up to stabilize and properly manage EU banks, drawing lessons from the crisis in the past. The US is a key ally in this. Global trade and investment was one of the drivers of Europe's renewed growth since the crisis. But as a result of economic rebalancing in China, nervousness on international financial markets and volatile oil prices, the immediate growth outlook is more uncertain. So we need to make the best possible use of our assets, and the transatlantic bond is one of them. Ours is already the biggest investment relationship in the world. The US accounts for some 32% of Europe's outward stock of foreign direct investment and 39% of the inward FDI stocks. And it is as strong as ever. Since the start of this century, Europe has attracted 55% of total US global investment, more than in any previous decade. And by comparison, China still accounts only for 1.4%. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership would cover 30% of world trade in goods and services, 40% of FDI, and 45% of the output. We can use this tried and tested combination to improve growth, for instance, in improving areas like public procurement. And we should use our combined weight to set the standards to the global economy. It is part of the aim also in the latest TTIP negotiating round on sustainable development, labor and environmental rights, and on regulatory issues in sectors like cars and medicines. But all this can only truly benefit our growth and jobs prospects if it doesn't fall on the rocky ground. Continued structural reform and responsible fiscal policies are as necessary as ever to reinvigorate our social and economic systems. Investment support alone, for that matter, monetary impulses cannot fix our economy in the longer term. It can only make it easier for us to do so. As global economic uncertainties are on the rise, we need to strengthen business and investor confidence. The best way to do so is to tackle structural weaknesses head-on. I'm therefore convinced that Europe must accelerate implementation of reform agendas to consolidate confidence and to allow reform effects feed into economic growth as soon and as much as possible. We also know that such efforts pay off. Research shows how member states that thoroughly reformed labor markets and social protection systems before the crisis have fared better than others. The effects of structural reforms undertaken since then have also become clear, and they can be especially helpful when pursued across the Eurozone. Overall, labour market resilience is growing, but problems regarding long-term and youth unemployment remain. Increasing poverty and social exclusion, growing inequality, and the erosion of the middle class are still need to be addressed. So, reform priorities include flexible and reliable contractual arrangements, lifelong learning strategies, modernizing social security systems, and focusing taxation systems on enhancing growth and jobs. Creating competitive product and services markets and a favorable business environment, which also means making our administrations more efficient, remains high on our agenda. The challenge is clear: staying the course, especially now that the worst of the crisis is behind us. But it's never too soon to start a reform. The same is true for the efforts to cut public deficits. We are also making progress there. This year, average public debt in Eurozone should go down to 87% of GDP, and deficits are expected to go down to 2.2%. Sound public finances are a precondition for sustainable growth. We need to keep up efforts to unburden Europe's economy of excessive debt so that governments that have fiscal space to play a countercyclical role when necessary. We also need them to maintain the credibility of our overall reform project, to prove to partners, markets, investors and citizens that they have a staying power to do what we promised. So if I come here with largely the same message as my speech last year. That's precisely the point. Our main economic policy priorities remain unchanged, so what we need to concentrate is on implementation. The political and societal context, I'm sorry to say, is though not the same. Political minds are now concentrated on refugee challenge. The terrorist threat is tangibly present. Geopolitical fragility threatens to overshadow everything else. Yet we need a strong economy and the related sense of unity as a European Union to cope with all these challenges. Our place in the world, our soft as well as hard power, will always depend on our ability to safeguard our economic fundamentals and on the success of our social economic model. Take migration. Our reaction since the start of the crisis has been aimed at making sure all countries shoulder their part of the responsibility as much as possible, as well as guarantee that there is some form of solidarity, especially when and where pressure goes beyond individual countries' capabilities. For this, we need more effective and unified border management coordinated at EU level. It also demands sufficient funding to underpin agreements with countries like Turkey, but also in Middle East and Northern Africa, who are indispensable partners in our fight against illegal migration and in meeting our responsibility towards those that truly deserve asylum in Europe. And as the inflow of refugees evolves into integration challenge, it also demands economic opportunities, well-performing labor markets, and sustainable public finances. We won't be able to meet this challenge unless we have a strong and stable economic foundation. Another example is Ukraine, where attractive European markets and concrete European assistance is the best tools we have. Within the European Commission, we are thinking about how to strengthen our macrofinancial assistance facility, which we use in Ukraine to allow us to contribute more and more effectively to the financial stability in regions of strategic importance for the European Union. This is a key part of our efforts to safeguard Europe's security and to address the root causes of the refugee crisis. But this too demands a flourishing economy. And it demands a collective European response, notably to maintain sanctions on Russia, that can only be sustained if the benefits of the EU in the broader sense are beyond doubt. That we are in it together, and together we are a power to be reckoned with. Because essentially, of course, the bigger picture is political. It all starts with a political will to move ahead together. Within Europe, as well as among our partners around the world, there is a clear sense of what is at stake. To overcome these challenges, we need more cooperation, new forms of integration and solidarity. Their legitimacy can only be based on fundamental values and logic underpinning the European project. On the broad realization that through European unity we can better defend our interest, strengthen our voice, and upgrade Europe's power internationally. The sovereign debt crisis has been met not only famously saying, but showing that we will do whatever it takes to uphold the euro. Rest assured that now the political will is there to do whatever it takes to uphold the European project. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a splendid tour d'horizon. My name is Anders Åström, and I'm a senior fellow here. And I should reveal that then Prime Minister Valdis Dombrovskis and I wrote a book. We published it in 2011, how Latvia came through the financial crisis. So we know each other rather well since that period. And what I would like to do now after this grand presentation, try to discuss a few moot points in the European economic policy. And this is a Eurogroup initiative. So the focus here is economic growth. Much of what you discussed here is stability to manage the crisis. But after all, if Europe is to be attractive, it has to grow. Effectively, Europe has today, the European Union has today, the same level of GDP as it had in 2008. So, of course, it was a big decline in 2009. But, and as you mentioned, Europe has now grown for 3 years and will grow this year also. But this is too tepid growth. It's a growth rate that the IMF predicts for this year to be 1.6%. And you have worked a lot on this in Latvia, how to get Latvia back to economic growth. So Latvia had a total decline of 24% in 2 years. Valdis Dombrovskis came in as Prime Minister in March 2009 when the economy was in a free fall. And he came in with a clear message. There are only two options. One is bad and the other is worse. I prefer the bad option without making any promises about fast economic growth. What do you think today is the most of the 3 most important things that the European Union should do in order to be more dynamic and grow faster?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Anders, for this introduction. As regards Europe growth, of course, it's worth noting that we are already past financial and economic crisis, and as I said, we are in the 4th year of economic recovery. And for this year and the next, we expect economic growth rates in EU around 2%. In Eurozone, somewhat less, 1.7 and 1.9 correspondingly for this year and the next. But of course, we also see that risks are on the downside. You mentioned those lower IMF figures. We'll be updating our macroeconomic forecast early May, and we also see that there may be some downwards correction, but I wouldn't expect any major shift. So we'll still be in this continued modest recovery. And so to strengthen this recovery, our economic policy priorities are threefold. I mentioned them in a speech. One is to facilitate investment, because investment has fell during the crisis in Europe and has not really rebounded to the pre-crisis level. So clearly we have investment gaps there. Second is structural reforms to strengthen the competitiveness, and it means structural reforms both at EU level, where it's mainly concentrates on deepening EU internal market, especially in areas like energy, like services, like digital single market, and at member states level. And at member states level, it may mean different things in different member states. It's country specific, but some of the recurring issues are labor market reforms, right balance between stability and security and flexibility, something which we call flexicurity. Those are questions on taxation, shifting tax burden away from labor to other tax bases less detrimental to growth, adapting our pension and social systems, ensuring their long-term sustainability in a context of population aging, opening up closed professions. So it's really the structural reforms agenda. And as it has been emphasized times and again by different players, we are now discussing different kind of stimulus, including monetary stimulus, something which needs to be kept in mind that with monetary policy alone, you cannot solve structural problems in the economy. So it's really a structural reform agenda. And the third priority is fiscal responsibility. And this is often seen as controversial. There are lots of talks about fiscal stimulus, but what our recent financial and sovereign debt crisis has taught us that there is a limited market willingness to finance debts and deficits in many European countries. In US, markets are perfectly fine to finance public debt of over 100% of GDP at low interest rate. It has not been the case in Europe. There were a number of countries, including my own country, Latvia, but also other countries like Ireland, like Portugal, like Greece, which had been cut off the financial markets and which had really to work to restore financial and fiscal stability. So this is something which we need to keep in mind, and really we still have very high overall debt levels. I was mentioning close to 90% of GDP. In EU treaty, we have set as a benchmark, as a kind of more or less safe debt level, 60% of GDP. So we're still 50% above that threshold. So fiscal responsibility is still something we need to keep in mind to ensure that our economic recovery is also sustainable.
Thank you very much. And something that you did not mention here is the fiscal burden on the economy. In Latvia, you brought down public expenditure to 36% of GDP, but in the EU as a whole, the level is around 47, 48% of GDP. In other countries that are highly developed, it's about 10% of GDP less than in the European Union, US, Japan, Australia, Canada. And the World Bank, in a big report on Europe's growth problem in 2012, emphasized this as the big problem in the European Union. The Baltic countries, Ireland, are at the levels. And Ireland, we saw last year growing by 8%. The evidence is quite clear, while Greece, Italy have very high levels of public expenditures. Shouldn't the European Union have a policy on this, and not only on the debt and level and the fiscal deficit?
Well, I would say there is a twofold answer. On one hand, yes, also our studies, European Commission studies, had shown when doing, for example, fiscal adjustment, which many countries had to do during and just after the crisis, that all in all, expenditure reduction is less detrimental to growth than tax raises. So this has been demonstrated in numerous studies. At the same time, from European Commission point of view, when coordinating macroeconomic and fiscal policies, we are not telling countries what level of public expenditure is appropriate. Because indeed, this is quite diverse across countries. This is not something which you can also change very quickly and very easily. And also evidence is mixed. You mentioned Greece and Italy, but then if you look, for example, at Global Competitiveness Index, Nordic countries, countries like Sweden, like Denmark, like Finland, are on the top of the list. And those are all countries actually with high taxation and high public expenditure as share of GDP. It means that if you redistribute income effectively, if there is no corruption and so on, actually you can stay very competitive on top of the world rankings, also with a high level of public expenditure. So this is not a parameter which we are now trying to regulate or tell a member state what appropriate level is.
And turning to what you did discuss here, service and digital markets. These are two big markets that are missing in Europe. In a normal modern economy, services are 70% of GDP. Europe has since long adopted a service directive, which is usually compared with a Swiss cheese because it's full of loopholes. And also, it's so unclear so that it cannot really be complied with, and it doesn't cover a large share of the service trade. What do you think can realistically be done about the service directive and the service trade?
Well, indeed, this is one of the points which we are also emphasize when discussing how to further improve our EU internal market, and it is well functioning in areas of goods. In areas of services, its two services directive is not yet fully implemented, and it can give additional tangible benefits to the economy. So this is one of the areas we continue to work and look at specific points what we can do to improve the functioning of services market. Of course, politically, it's, as we know, very complicated. Initially, it was already quite a few years ago when European Commission came with a proposal on services directive. It was actually far more far-reaching. Commissioner Bolkestein was the one proposing this services directive, but then it had quite strong backlash both among EU member states and in European Parliament. The directive was even kind of nicknamed Bolkestein-Frankenstein directive, whatever. And it was watered down, it's true. So you said that it's full of loopholes. It's a result of political compromise. Initial European Commission's proposal actually has been far more far-reaching, and we're still actually continuing to work and convince member states on the benefits of better integrated services market. And on digital, this is something which has developed over the past decades, and one can say that currently we actually do not have digital single market. We have 28 digital markets, and that's why we have adopted this digital market strategy to knock down basically regulatory barriers within the EU, to introduce also more streamlined legislation in terms of digital, like intellectual property rights, in issues like geo-blocking, in issues like connectability. So this is very high of our agenda, and our good colleague, former Prime Minister of Estonia, Andrus Ansip, is in charge of this dossier.
And then moving over to unemployment. As you mentioned, EU unemployment now stands at 10%. Here in the US, it's currently exactly 5%. And there are two groups of countries in the European Union that have similarly low unemployment. On the one hand, Denmark and Germany with flexicurity systems, as you mentioned, and then also Britain and Ireland, which have basically American-style labor markets that are extremely liberal. And then we have the opposite, with particularly Greece and Spain, with unemployment over 20% and youth unemployment over 50%. And these are long-lasting structural unemployments. Can the European Union as such do more about it? Or how come that these countries within the European Union that have failed so miserably taking care of their young people, that they continue doing so year after year?
Well, Europe can and it should take care of this issue. When I was mentioning structural reform agenda, actually the first thing I was mentioning was labor market reforms. And when we are discussing reforms in a number of member states, actually labor market reforms are on top of agenda. And a number of things had been done. For example, in Spain, in recent years, they have done quite substantial reforms, basically to reduce the fragmentation, to reduce the duality of the labor market, because unfortunately what often it comes out that high protection for some means much less protection for others, especially newcomers to the labor market, which often happen to be young people, which are often to a large extent locked out of this very protected part of the labor market. So this is clearly what needs to be addressed. Spain actually, after implementing these reforms, now has very rapid decrease in unemployment, even though, as you said, the starting position was tragically high. Greece, we had some back and forth with the new Greek government, but we convinced them not to unilaterally undo already the things which had been done by the previous governments. Italy recently also made several important steps in labor market reform. So I would say this work is ongoing. Of course, politically, again, it's not easy, but we keep this pressure and encouragement to member states to do more in this regard. And then at European level, we have also some targeted initiatives, like, for example, Youth Employment Initiative, Youth Guarantee, exactly to deal with youth unemployment, to provide also member states with EU financing, to facilitate jobs for young people, or if they are not able to find jobs, to get them back in education or training, so that they can adapt to the changing labor market conditions and find employment already with this new skills and training.
Yeah, it used to be said that in Spain it's easier to get a divorce than to sack a worker, but that is fortunately no longer true. And you, at the end, you mentioned Ukraine. I have one particular concern about EU assistance to Ukraine. What the Baltic countries and the Central European countries benefited from, it was an open European market from early on, and quickly they switched from very little trade with the European Union to 2/3 of their exports going to the European Union within a few years. Ukraine has now completed this association agreement with the European Union, with a certain hiatus in Holland, but we can leave that aside. But this so-called deep and comprehensive free trade agreement contains 36 quotas for Ukrainian exports to the European Union. And as you could suspect, these quotas cover the main export products from Ukraine to the European, or export products generally. And most of it is agriculture. And Ukraine's exports, 1/3 is agriculture. And the European share has now increased a bit only because the trade with Russia has collapsed. But in the first year that this agreement was in place, Ukrainian exports to the European Union actually fell. So when you talk to these big Ukrainian agriculture producers, for example, the big producer of chicken meat, well, they say, sorry, the EU quota is only 1% of Ukrainian production capacity of chicken meat. So we sell to China and the Middle East instead. It doesn't make sense to try to sell to the EU. Same if you ask about egg, it's also 1% of the capacity. And agriculture is always difficult. But do you think that the European Union could do something to open up to Ukrainian exports on a bigger scale? It's not your table, but you obviously know about it.
Well, I would say now it's only a year or so, or maybe 2 years if we count this unilateral opening by the EU to Ukraine. Since this free trade agreement has entered into force and it's now in provisional application, also taking into account Dutch referendum, when we still need to see what the government intentions are as regards the outcome of the referendum, because it's consultative. So it's probably too early to draw firm conclusions. Of course, we are ready to continue to discuss and to see what can be done also more to facilitate the import of Ukrainian goods in the EU, because this trade opportunity is probably one of the best things we can do economically in our relations with Ukraine. As you mentioned, agriculture is always a very difficult sector. We know also from TTIP negotiations, for example. Yeah? But indeed, we know that there are quotas on a number of agricultural goods, and once we see how this DCFTA application is evolving, we can look what are possible further steps. There is still, it also must be noted, lots of so to say phytosanitary work to be done in Ukraine to make its producers basically compliant with EU regulations, and EU is also providing technical assistance on this for Ukraine so that it can faster reach this compliance to the broader range of companies.
Thank you very much. I would like to open up the floor. Fran Burwell, do we have a mic? We don't need a mic. Yeah.
I have a loud voice.
Fran Burwell.
Fran Burwell, one of the vice presidents here. Thank you very much for your comments. One of the things that is facing the European Union is the British vote on June 23rd. Could you comment on the after effects, should it be to leave, in terms of its impact not on the British, but on the EU, and particularly on the economic fallout, whether it's long-term? The British have long been one of the more open market economies in the EU, and also in terms of perhaps whether there'll be any currency instability. So long-term and short-term, what might be any economic impact that you might see on the rest of the EU should the British vote to leave?
Okay. In short, of course, European Commission's preliminary assessment shows that it's much more beneficial for both UK and EU is for UK to stay in the EU. And that's basically the message we are currently passing across. answer to your question is actually not a very straightforward one, because something we also don't quite see from this leave camp is, so what kind of model of relations between UK and EU they are actually proposing, and it really depends on what's really on table. So it's at this stage we are not able to engage in that kind of speculations. Our assessment is certainly that in any of the scenario, leaving would be economically much more detrimental for UK and for the EU. But also from European Commission side, to be clear, we're also not actively campaigning. We are not going to UK and saying that vote stay, for this not to be perceived as some kind of outside pressure. So it's really now in the hands of British voters.
Thank you. Andrea Montanino.
Yeah, Andrea Montanino. I'm the director of the Global Business Economics. One of the legacy of the crisis is clearly high public debt in most European countries. I mean, there's no room of maneuver for most countries, not now, but for the years ahead. Don't you think it's time to start working on some Europeization of public debt in the terms of having an agency, a European agency, might be the ESM, issuing, say, up to 5% of European GDP new debt to finance infrastructure, human capital, and research and development. Leaving aside for a moment political constraint that we know, I'd like to know your view on that.
We know this is not a new debate. This idea was reflected, for example, in four presidents' report on deepening economic and monetary union. It is not there, though, in more recent five presidents' report on completing EMU. So it's not something which we are now actively discussing or planning some proposals from European Commission side. What we are now concentrating is basically on moving forward, implementing the proposals which are there in a five presidents' report on completing EMU. Of course, there are also elements for longer term consideration, like for example, euro area treasury or euro area stabilization function, which can provide also some fiscal instruments to deal with macroeconomic imbalances or problems at euro area level. But those ideas are still now being developed. We are in a process, broad process of consultation as regards those more far-reaching proposals, or what is called stage 2 of the five presidents' report.
Please.
Good morning, Francis Bouchard with Hamilton Place Strategies. You opened your remarks a little bit about the relationship between the United States and Europe, and I know this isn't your portfolio, but I wonder if you could talk about TTIP and your views of how that would impact growth across Europe.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, I mentioned it already in my speech that we certainly see TTIP as a priority in terms of our trade negotiations. We hope to conclude the negotiations still under Obama administration. There are two rounds of talks foreseen, one later in April, so later this month in New York, another in July in Brussels. And indeed, we see number of tangible benefits for both economies, and we see also possibility to use TTIP as some kind of a standard for other trade negotiations with other regions. So it's, I think, also a good opportunity for EU and US to set global trade agreements standards. So it's high on our agenda, and we hope to make tangible progress still during this year.
Andreas?
Well, coming back to growth in Europe, I remember very well several years ago Angela Merkel was presenting three numbers as a big problem for growth in Europe. I mean, Europe has 7% of global population. At that time, it was 20% of global GDP, now perhaps even less, and around 50% of social spending. And that is, and even Angela Merkel was saying that this is exactly the major problem for Europe. So what do you think? What will happen in 20 years' time, let's say at 2030? Will the world become more socialized, or Europe will become less socialized?
Well, you know that Europe's social market economy is something which we value very high. It's one of the foundings, one of the principles of our development. So we must look how to adopt this European social model to the changing circumstances. And when I was mentioning structural reforms, I was exactly mentioning also pension and social systems, because indeed we will need to adapt our pension and social systems to the fact of aging society, to the fact that the dependence ratios of people at pension age versus people at working age will continue to increase, and that we need to ensure long-term sustainability of our pension and social systems. And of course, if you do it in advance, taking gradual steps, you can do it also in a politically more acceptable way. So some of the examples which we advise to the member states is adjusting the pensions age, linking it basically with life expectancy. There are questions which are relating to setting up of the funded pension schemes, second pillar pensions, third pillar pensions. So it's indeed one of the very serious challenges we are facing, and we are already dealing with this, and will be dealing with this in coming years and even decades.
Thank you.
Thank you. Michael Stetcher from the Center for the Study of the Presidency. You mentioned energy market reforms as one of the issues that you are focused on. What are some of the issues that are being discussed at the Commission level on diversifying sources of natural gas?
Mm-hmm. Let me follow up here. Ambassador Morningstar and I have been pursuing a campaign against Nord Stream 2, and which is very much going against the grain of diversifying gas supply. So if you could add that to the question, can Nord Stream 2 be stopped?
Okay, so on energy union. This is a very complex task, this energy union, and it has several dimensions of it. First is liberalization of the energy markets, electricity market, natural gas market, and so on. And for this we have so-called third energy package. We are working of implementation of this and basically liberalizing our energy markets. This is one work direction which is ongoing. Another is interconnections, because to have a well-functioning energy market, you also need physical infrastructure to move energy, would it be electricity or natural gas or whatever, from one country to another, from one region to another. So there is a program on facilitating interconnections. so-called Connecting Europe facility, which has, well, one transport arm, but one energy arm exactly to deal with the energy interconnection. So this is second, to really get infrastructure so that we can have functioning energy market among EU member states. Third is indeed diversifying the energy sources, also decreasing our dependency on fossil fuels. There are targets as regards the share of renewables. There are targets as regards improvement of energy efficiency, reduction of CO2 emissions, and there also we're looking at the ways to diversify natural gas supplies, now coming more specifically to your question. And there number of things had been done, including creation of reverse flows from Central Europe to Eastern, Southeastern Europe to ensure that those regions cannot be cut off natural gas supplies in case there are some interruptions with Ukraine, as it has been the case in previous years. There are work ongoing on setting LNG terminals to be able to get LNG gas to certain terminals. There's work ongoing, and it's in different states of advancement in different member states of opening up natural gas infrastructure to third parties, to independent providers of natural gas. So all this work is ongoing. As regards Nord Stream 2, of course, there are quite a few concerns. Number of member states have also written to European Commission as regards this project, seeing it not in line with EU energy policy objectives. And we are currently assessing this project. It's at the stage of assessment. I cannot now come with what the outcome of this assessment will be, but European Commission is carefully evaluating this project.
If I, yes, one last question there.
Thank you. Leandra Bernstein, Sputnik News. A question about migration and the economic impacts of the border issues within the European Union, what some have been calling the erosion of the Schengen system, and then also the impact in terms of the high unemployment that you're seeing.
Well, as regards migration crisis and Schengen, first it's worth noting that it is within Schengen rules that member states can introduce temporary border controls if faced with some unusual circumstances. And this is exactly what is currently happening. So what is currently happening is within Schengen rules. And the European Commission, of course, is working to ensure that there is no erosion of Schengen, as you mentioned. But of course, this was something I also addressed in a speech, that we have Schengen, so we have free movement of people without border controls. But in this case, if we want to preserve it, we need to strengthen our external borders. We need to make sure that persons arriving in Europe are properly registered, screened against security databases, that member states are sticking with their obligations as regards Schengen, as regards Dublin system, and so on. And this is a work which is currently ongoing. As regards the impact on economy, our assessment is that, and there is a big if the people arriving in Europe, refugees, if they are properly integrated in a labor market, there can be actually a small positive contribution to EU's economy. And if you look at currently, probably the most of refugees are in Germany, where actually the level of unemployment is relatively low. So there is this possibility to integrate the refugees and integrate them in the labor market. But this is, I would say, one of the key challenges. There are short-term challenges which we need to address. There are humanitarian aspects, there are security aspects, and so on. But in medium to longer term, it's mainly an integration challenge if we manage to integrate those people properly in the labor market. And then it can be actually a positive contribution to EU's economy.
If I may end with a rather mundane question, how do you manage to fly in and out of Brussels now when the airport hardly works?
Well, it must be said that airport is now gradually restoring its capacity,
Yeah.
so also doing necessary repair work. So it's temporary, I would say, interruption, and it's being dealt with. In between, there are a number of flights which operate to and from Brussels. For example, I came to Washington here with a direct flight from Brussels. And otherwise, people use nearby airports, Amsterdam, Paris, Charleroi, which are all just maybe 2 hours or even less by train from Brussels.
Yeah. Thank you very much for a splendid tour de force. I think that all of us have learned much more about what the European Union does and can do for economic growth. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.